for some more kitchen table astrology with Hampshire College astrologer Dr. Salman. Oh, no. Don't confuse astrology and astronomy. And that is a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. The differences between astrology and astronomy, because something astronomically interesting is happening in the next week or so that is also very interesting to astrology people. But before we do that, Kainat Studios, which you run, Dr. Salman Hameed, Mr. Universe, you are now officially the Carl Sagan of Pakistan, right? Because isn't Kainat Kids going to be included in all the public schools of Pakistan?
Thank you. Well, yes. So Kainat Kids, we have recently signed a memorandum of understanding with the federal government over there to include clips from our kids series. So we do grown-up videos and we also do kids videos that will be included in the public schools over there. And so, yes, so that's an ongoing process. It takes a while. And we are hoping, this is a big hope and a big plug. Right now our content is in Urdu, which is spoken in Pakistan. It is also adaptable in India as well.
Because Hindi and Urdu are very similar, right?
Spoken language can be similar. And one of our co-hosts actually is from India, and the other one is from Pakistan. But this year, in 2025, our kid series is also going to be in English. And we are hoping, we are in conversations with other countries as well, where this actually content can also be included in other school systems, or it could be on, of course, it's available on YouTube. But stay tuned. I will let you know once the English content is out, because, of course, that will be relevant to a much bigger population.
I love it, especially because I know how influential Carl Sagan's cosmos was to you as a young person. Now come full circle to the people of your home nation, Pakistan. You're that person now, in their own language, telling them these things that are so fascinating to you and to me and to the universe. Back to cosmology and astrology. There is a lot of excitement about something that's happening in the sky on January 25th, I believe, right?
Well, so there are a few things that are happening. One of them is actually tonight, Monday night, and that is you have full moon, which is very interesting. No,
that's
full
when I turn into a werewolf.
That's right. But you also have these days Mars, which is quite bright in the night sky.
So is that the one that we see close to the moon right now?
Yes.
Okay, because I always think it's Venus, but it's not always Venus.
Well, although the moon moves with respect to the planets every day and with respect to the stars, but tonight actually there's going to be a lunar occultation. And what that means is...
the moon is getting an eye test.
That's right. But what it means is that it's going to actually come in front of Mars. In certain locations, you'll be able to see that. In other places, it's just going to be very close to Mars. But in other places, especially in North America, for example, it's going to, in fact, it's going to cover up Mars, and then Mars, you will see Mars from the other side, and it's going to happen around 9:21.
So we'll see what looks like a star, but is actually a planet, and then the moon will move in front of it and block it out for a little bit.
That is correct.
Yeah.
And usually it's really cool because you can actually learn a lot about the features of the moon. So these type of things happen a lot, like, regarding one planet can come in front of a star as well, planetary occultation that happens. And because background objects are like point-like, although planets are a little bit more, not just a point, but a little bit more of a disk, but you can actually learn a lot about the object in front. So in this case, for example, if you want to learn more about the moon, you can, because you have this point-like source behind it, and you can actually see features really highlighted when it goes behind the moon. And so that is happening today, but that is not the only thing. Right now, in the evening sky, you have a parade of planets. So you have Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, all available, and for your convenience, in the evening sky and not in the early morning sky. Usually say, oh yeah, you have to get up at 4 a.m. and you see them. No!
When I did a morning show, that was great. Now that I don't, the evening sky, I much prefer it. Even late nights.
That's exactly right. And so Venus and Saturn right now are wonderfully visible towards the western skies after sunset, or even actually Venus would be visible even before sunset because it will be after sunset, but before it gets really dark.
Yeah, yeah.
Because Venus is the brightest object other than the sun and the moon.
So if you care to find me, look to the western sky.
That's
It's from Wicked. It's from Wicked.
Okay.
I had to throw it in there. I'm holding space for Venus and the other planets. Yeah.
And so that is there. And then, although Saturn is not that bright right now, but then you can also find Jupiter high up in the sky, and of course Mars, which actually just recently went through the closest distance between the Earth and Mars. So it was actually relatively close by. So it's very bright right now.
And that's the one that will be eclipsed by the moon tonight.
That's exactly right. So you have all of these planets available, and one thing you will notice is that, if you haven't noticed before, that they almost form a line in the sky, and that is kind of cool. And that tells you that, hey, all of these planets are in a disk-like shape, sort of like it's called an ecliptic. All the planets are orbiting around the sun in this line. And this is the line that you see. And in fact, you can extend it if you try to do that from where the sun set. And you just make an arc around it. And you're going to see sort of like all of these planets roughly aligned with that line, which is called the ecliptic.
So the ecliptic is like a disk, kind of like the rings of Saturn. So Saturn's rings aren't solid objects. It's a bunch of stuff orbiting Saturn, ice and things, that make it look like this disk shape. Same thing with the planets orbiting the sun. We're in this disk around the sun.
This is where one of the big questions was, if you want to understand how our solar system formed, we have to explain why all of these planets are, for example, in this one plane. And then also, of course, there are other questions why they are moving in the same direction and rotating in the same direction as well.
Right.
There are exceptions, but in general, they do that. And all of this stuff gets explained by the sort of like our theory of the formation of the solar system, which says that we were part of a big nebula, our sun formed from it, and it was rotating as it collapsed into our sun. Along with the material around it, it collapsed into a disk, and out of that disk, that you have these planets formed out of that. And because the disk material was moving in a certain way, as you would imagine all of that material to be spiraling or spinning in one direction, this is exactly how the planets formed and how the planets are rotating.
And why they're in the same plane. I think of this, I know that there's pressure from below. This isn't a perfect analogy, but if you're on a pottery wheel, you get a big chunk of clay and it's spinning, 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 and you push on it, it eventually turns into a disc.
So it's a conservation of angular momentum. And so this is the direction, which is the least opposing direction. So there is no preferable direction in space. But when you are rotating, there is a one particular direction where it's going to be less resistance, and this is the direction how it's going to collapse in. And so that's how planets form, and that's the reason you find planets more or less in a sort of like, in an ecliptic or in a plane, and that happens everywhere. So most solar systems, almost all of the solar systems we see, in general, we see them in those lines because that is how planets form around stars.
So people that love astrology are really psyched about this alignment of the planets. It is something that doesn't happen frequently, right? Wasn't it like a very thousands, if not more, years ago that it was aligned like this, or am I wrong about that?
You are absolutely wrong about that.
The TikTok videos and things that I see that are saying how big a deal this is.
No.
Not that big a deal.
No, this happens actually relatively frequently, a couple of years or something like that. I don't know how frequently it is, but this is nothing. And remember, just because you see them line up in our sky doesn't mean they are actually close together.
Right.
So, for example, Saturn and Venus that you see in the night sky, they are going to come close and close together. They're going to be very close. In fact, in the evening of January 17th and 18th, they're going to almost, you would look like they're almost kissing each other, and they're very close. But it is because the way we are looking into the sky, in actuality, Mars is much closer to us compared to Saturn. So it's just, to us, it looks like they are close. And It has nothing to do. There are no impact on us. There is nothing that impacts on it because if you think about, is it gravity that is impacting us? No, because they are quite far away. Monte, your gravity is impacting me more than the moon or even these objects that are far, far, far away.
Thank you.
Exactly. And
I didn't know it had that kind of effect on you, Salman.
well, so that is one of the things, sort of like, that it's a beautiful show and we should appreciate it. I actually find it really incredible. I think I've mentioned this before because we also talk on Mondays, and that's when the trash pickup is. And on Sunday night, I take out trash, and I always love taking out trash because, you get to look up in the sky. And it's very cold usually. Yeah. So what I mean to say is, like, normally I would love to go out every night and look at it, but it's too cold, so I don't. But because I have to take trash out, I'm forced to. But I look up in the sky, and when you are looking at the stars, most of these stars, the light is coming from like tens of light years, if not hundreds of light years away, or maybe a few thousand light years away. And so that's what you are looking at. But even with planets. So last night when I was out, I could see Mars, I could see Venus, and I'm like, it's really cool. And then I saw Saturn close to Venus, and I'm like, well, you are looking at the depth, even though your brain is telling you that it's just in our sky and they are really together. But knowing that Saturn is actually much farther away than Mars, you can almost visualize depth in the sky. Mm-hmm. And the same thing you can do right now. Apart from these planets, you have Orion, the constellation of Orion, which is the most beautiful and prominent constellation in the sky. You can look at it and sort of like the knife of Orion, the hunter. So there is a belt underneath the knife. That's where Orion Nebula lies, about 1,500 light years away, where actually a lot of baby stars are forming. So we were talking about formation of planets. That's the place where it's happening. So you can actually look at, with the naked eye, you don't see the nebula, but you can actually look at it and you can imagine seeing this depth in the sky. You can see Betelgeuse, the star that is really on the shoulder of Orion. And, and you also know that, well, this is actually not the same distance as Mars or Saturn. This is actually hundreds of light years away.
So we're looking at this thing on what looks like a two-dimensional piece of black paper. But in reality, it is so vastly distant between not only all of those stars and the nebula in these constellations that we have projected to be two-dimensional, but even our own planets and our own solar system. They are not really in a line. They are very, very far away from each other.
And knowing that is beautiful. Yeah. What I was trying to say is that comes back to the astrology part, and I get why people historically have wanted to ascribe power to stars, and it makes sense because your life, there are a lot of uncertainties in life. Life is hard, and so you want to gain any kind of control over it. And one of the ways to control it was maybe these objects in the sky, the way they look like a hunter, a lion, or whatever, and these are the shapes that our brains are designed to detect. We find shapes everywhere, including clouds, including tea leaves or stars and everything. But then why are those shapes there? So we ascribe those meanings to it, and then we try to figure out whether we can explain what is happening on Earth, because we, of course, think we are the most important things in the universe. So if they are out there, it must be because of us. And so if the way they are moving, they must be telling something about us. But in reality, as I mentioned, if you think in terms of the depth part, no, they are doing their own thing. It really has nothing to do with us. And of course, this is all apparent. The appearance of the shapes and things like that. So historically, astrology has been important, and even today people can ascribe things to it, but in reality there is beauty in knowing about these depths in skies and how it moves. And we have to sort out our own problems. It's not the stars that are going to tell us anything. And I should also mention that even for astrology, it used to actually tell us a lot more things. For example, there used to be horoscopes for cities where London had a horoscope, Baghdad had a horoscope. There were horoscopes of cities because they could actually tell, first of all, weather forecast for the whole year, because we didn't know about the weather. How do you figure out, how do you get a control over it? Well, stars must be telling us. And
Now we know it's Dave Hayes, the weather nut.
that's exactly right. And you had forecasts for fires, predictions for fires, because fires were uncertain.
Yeah.
They used to happen. So they used to look for, there was a horoscope for fires. Today we don't have that. But we still have humans that are much more complicated, and there are uncertainties about that. So we say, oh, it must be those stars. They're not telling us about the fires anymore. And by the way, since we are mentioning fires, LA fires, I mean, that's crazy, and it's terrible tragedy and things like that. So I don't want to make light of that aspect, because that is also, in some sense, climate change has been a big part of that. So today, the uncertainties lies in human relations, and so we ascribe those explanations or look for those explanations up in the sky for that.
When you were Googling about this alignment of planets that will be happening, it's starting to happen right now, but I think the 25th of January is supposedly the highlight of it all. Even you, an astronomer, were, force-fed by Google some astrology.
It was interesting. It came up when I was looking for it, the Google AI, which I didn't ask for it, but it gave me the sort of like, the first estimate. And it gave me scientific information about planetary alignment, and that was great. Like, I was like, oh, okay, it's because I just wanted to check sort of like specific dates and things like that. Although I do avoid AI. I don't go to click on AI. Mm-hmm. I go to NASA websites or others. But it was just up there. I was like, oh, so what else is it telling me? And it was interesting that rest of the stuff, so the prompts that it gave was like, what is planetary alignment? And it says, well, here are these planets that are going to appear in the sky like that. So that was correct information. But then it also says what it means. And I was like, oh. And it said underneath, without me asking it, that it is a time of self-reflection and self-evaluation. And for a minute, I was like, is it AI talking to itself, where it should be self-reflection and self-evaluation, or is it telling me? But anyway, that's besides the point, but that's what it tells me. And then it says how it impacts you. And then it said that it can impact your motivation, anger, sex drive, and passion. It can also cause you to feel on edge, triggered, or overly sensitive, which you can imagine, which I am right now, because this is the problem with AI, for example, where you are mixing in scientific information with astrological information, and there are no flags, for example. There is no distinction in there. And in this age of misinformation, this is going to be a bigger and bigger problem, because people are just going to look for it. Hey, I'm just going to Google it. And so as a teacher, I mean, I've been teaching this stuff, and as an astronomer, as a scientist, we are worried about how to talk about accuracy in science, because that is crucial. As Carl Sagan said, that we have designed our world around science and technology, and yet we have an education system which basically leads you to ignorance, or leads you not to understand what science is, and that is what he called a recipe for disaster. So we have spent a lot of time thinking about how do you differentiate between good information versus bad information. And to me, this particular thing was deeply problematic, because here there was some information that was scientifically accurate, but within it, next of the questions actually led you towards astrology. Now, this is relatively benign. It's not necessarily, although Carl Sagan did say, like, it's a recipe for disaster, yes, on a long-term scale. But this is a good example where you are being fed misinformation in a much more subtle way, where you won't even care that you are being fed misinformation. And this is how it can get absorbed by you, because you were just looking at information about what is happening, what is up in the night sky, and you were also given, what does planetary alignment means? It means that it can lead you to issues with motivation, anger, and so on and so forth, which it has nothing to do with actual planetary alignment. But now, through osmosis, in some ways, AI osmosis, you think, oh, it does have some impact. I read somewhere, because you did.
Yeah.
Right? So I think so this is an example where how we have to be really careful about it, and why this is such a problem. I did not ask for AI to give me information. It did. And it had a mixture of accurate and inaccurate information. And this is on something that is not crucial, but I think over the period of time, we are going to be in a lot of trouble in figuring it out what is real and what is not, and what the information that we get fed.
What is real is that you will have a beautiful display in the sky of our planets in our solar system, a better understanding of how they are all in one platter type plane, and then you'll ask the question if it's got Venus there, if it's got Mars, if it's got Saturn, where's Uranus?
Actually, it is invisible. I mean, but you will need a telescope for Uranus for looking at Uranus. But here is the thing. I should also mention one other cool thing right now, and this also connects in some sense to astrology and astronomy. Mars is in retrograde right now. And for astrologers, it goes like, oh my goodness. But all that means, this is really cool for the last couple of months. In fact, I think from December to February, Mars is what we call, astronomers, what they call in retrograde motion. And what that means is that when we look at Mars, it moves, planets move with respect to the background stars. And planet means wanderers, because they wander with respect to the background stars, which we consider them as fixed, although we know they also move, but in our sky, they don't appear to move on a shorter time frame. But planets like Mars, like Mercury and others, they'll be moving with respect to background star in one direction, and then over a period of time, it looks like that it is stopping and then moving in the opposite direction before resuming this direction. And it takes a couple of months. And this was a big puzzle. And for history of science perspective, that's why, I mean, all of this stuff is really cool. Forget about the astrology part. The actual part is really cool. This was a big question. What kind of model can explain the planets moving around, whatever, and this weird retrograde motion? And so when you had, for thousands of years, Earth at the center of the universe and everything moving around us, this was a huge puzzle. And they had to really figure out, how do we explain these retrograde motions, and in particular of Mars, which was so obvious. And so they came up with, for example, you might have heard of it, epicycles. So meaning to say that it's not that the Mars is just orbiting around the Earth. Mars is actually on another epicycle or another circle, which is orbiting around the Earth. And all of that was meant to explain this retrograde motion. And then, of course, as our observations improved, we had to keep on adding more and more epicycles to it to explain the observations. And ultimately, it turns out it's much simpler to explain this retrograde motion if the sun is at the center and Earth and Mars are both orbiting. And what happens here is that because the Earth is moving, is a little bit closer to the sun, and it's moving faster than Mars, so in its orbits, it overtakes Mars. And just like a car, that happens, like, that once you are approaching it, as it appears to go slower and slower, stop, and move backwards. Mm-hmm. This is what happens. And so the retrograde motion was explained much more simply and beautifully with sun being at the center of the universe. So retrograde motion, Mars's retrograde motion, for example, is beautiful, and it is important in history of science. So really cool.